Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Odyssey Recaps Below the Surface Edition. Today we are recapping Book 17, titled by Emily Wilson as Insults and Abuse. We last left off with Odysseus and Telemachus forming a plan to infiltrate the palace to gather intel on the suitors, the palace slaves and staff, and Penelope. Odysseus is still in disguise, but I think it's pretty clear who he is, so I'm just going to be referring to him as Odysseus, but please know he is still very much in disguise as an elderly beggar. So the chapter opens, the sun rises, and Telemachus tells Eumaeus the swineherd that he must return home to find his mother and assure her in person that he is really alive. He asks Eumaeus to take the disguised Odysseus into town so that he can beg in the streets for food. Telemachus leaves and heads straight to the palace and is immediately swarmed by his nanny and the other slave women, who are greeting him with tears and kisses to welcome him home. The phrasing here is important. The poem talks about the women owned by strong-willed Odysseus. A good reminder that Odysseus is the true master of the house, even after such a long absence, and that these women are his property, not his workers. This is going to come up again later, but for now, consider how these women are extensions of Odysseus' household and wealth. The suitors are abusing every part of Odysseus' holdings. They are eating his food, using his furniture, and also abusing the women of the house itself. Furthermore, though they greet Telemachus warmly, they aren't his women. They're still his father's, as is everything else in the palace. At least for now. Penelope comes down from her bedroom and also hugs and kisses her son while weeping. She tells him she thought she would never see him again after he secretly sailed to Pylos. Consider the position this left her in. Her son, who she still very much sees as a boy and not a man, vanished into the night, setting off across the same sea that took her husband from her, leaving her alone in a house full of aggressive and violent suitors who are growing increasingly impatient with her refusal to select a husband. Without Telemachus, she has no immediate male relative in the house to protect her. This is an incredibly precarious position, and Telemachus leaving the way he did left her intensely vulnerable. The journey wasn't just a risk for him, but also for her, and one that, once again, she had no say in. His return, though primarily a relief to find her beloved son alive, also means that once again she has a much needed male ally standing between her and the 118 suitors and their attendants. She asks him what happened on his voyage, and Telemachus' response is interesting. He tells her not to try to manipulate his feelings, that he survived the danger, and then orders her to go back upstairs, take a bath, and put on clean clothing, then for her and her women to stay in her room, sacrificing and praying to all the gods that Zeus may grant them revenge. He tells her he's going to town to fetch a stranger he brought home on his travels. Then he leaves. This response seems overly harsh. It's possible that he's trying to shield her and her serving women from his and Odysseus' plan to test the violent and aggressive suitors, but there's also another element to this: systemic misogyny. In her introduction, Emily Wilson discusses the tense relationship Telemachus has with Penelope, and also his treatment of the rest of the women in the palace. She says that he practices masculine self-assertion by putting down his mother. Of one incident in particular, she says that Telemachus is consistent in his notion that masculine maturity means the suppression and exclusion of women and the suppression of female voices. She has a lot to say about this in her introduction, and it is fascinating, but in the interest of brevity, I'm just going to say that her point seems to be that stepping fully into manhood for Telemachus means subjugating and oppressing women, even his mother, who has been very skillfully keeping a kingdom running for 20 years. Regardless of his intentions, Penelope obeys her son, disappearing upstairs with her serving women to bathe, change, and pray for revenge. Telemachus retrieves his spear and marches through the hall, 2 dogs at his side, and as he walks, Athena covers him in godlike grace. The contrast between the boy who left in tears after trying to speak to the suitors and the man who has returned is striking. Telemachus is no longer armed only with words and pleas for respect. He is ready to demand it at the point of a spear. The suitors are all amazed at the sight of him. They gather around him, acting friendly while still secretly planning his murder. Telemachus leaves the crowd of suitors and instead finds his shipmate, who brought Theoclymenus to the palace, the man who Telemachus picked up when he was leaving Pylos, who was on the run for committing murder. His shipmate tells Telemachus to send some slaves to his house to collect the rich gifts given to him by Helen and Menelaus. But Telemachus replies with caution, telling him that the situation at the palace is still dangerous, and if he is murdered and the suitors divide his father's wealth between themselves, he doesn't want them also to get the treasure that he managed to acquire for himself. He tells the crewmate to keep the treasure at his house for now, and if he manages to kill the suitors, then he'll come retrieve it. But if the suitors succeed in murdering him, he would prefer that his shipmate keep the legendary treasure himself, rather than let his murderers get it. Telemachus and Theoclymenus go to be bathed and dressed by their slaves before sharing a meal with Penelope, after which Penelope asks Telemachus to tell her if he managed to hear any news of his father quickly before the suitors return. Telemachus relays that he saw King Nestor in Pylos, who had no news of his father. Then he went to see King Menelaus in Sparta, who was enraged to hear about the suitors, and he called them stupid cowards, and said that Odysseus will destroy them all in his return, like a fierce lion destroying suckling fawns. Then he tells her what Menelaus asked the shape-shifting sea god Proteus, who can tell no lies. He told Menelaus that Odysseus was trapped on an island by the sea nymph Calypso, and that he cannot come home as he has no ships to row him home across the sea's broad back. Penelope is understandably conflicted, not sure what to think, when Theoclymenus speaks up and tells Penelope that he will reveal the whole truth with a prophecy. He swears by Zeus, by Xenia, and by the hearth of Odysseus that Odysseus has, in fact, already returned to Ithaca. He has learned what the suitors are doing and is plotting ruin for them all. He says he knows all this through the bird omens that he saw when he first met Telemachus. Penelope, having spent years receiving similar predictions and prophecies that never came true, answers carefully. She says she hopes he's right, and that if he is, she will reward him greatly. A clever answer, not risking angering the gods by doubting the prophecy, but also clearly no longer willing to simply believe every hungry stranger who comes to her door with news of her lost husband. While they're having this conversation, the suitors are outside the palace, playing games of darts and discuses. Discodes? Games that are not without danger, but also games that are helping the suitors maintain strength and accuracy, skills that would come in useful in a battle. The suitors finish their games and head inside for dinner, spreading out in Odysseus' chairs and killing goats, rams, pigs, and a cow and cooking them for a feast. The sheer volume and array of meats here displays their horrific gluttony. They are eating like kings or gods, parasitically feeding off the labor of Odysseus' household. Meanwhile, a disguised Odysseus is slowly being led into town by Eumaeus, who is leading the poor beggar carefully down the stony path into town. They reach a fountain near town and meet a goat herder named Melanthius, who is on his way to bring some of Odysseus' finest goats to feed the suitors. When Melanthius sees the swineherd and the elderly beggar, he begins to insult them, letting loose with a string of offensive taunts aimed at both men, telling the disguised Odysseus that if he tries to go beg at the palace, the suitors will hurl stools at him. Then the goat herder lunges at Odysseus and kicks him in the hip bone. Consider how dangerous and debilitating a hip injury is to the elderly today. Then imagine how catastrophic this would be for an elderly beggar with no access to modern medicine. This act is needlessly cruel and could very easily result in a slow and painful death for a man who hasn't spoken a single word to the goat herder yet. But, thankfully, Odysseus is not really an elderly beggar, but is simply disguised as one. The powerful kick doesn't even move him, but it does enrage him, and Odysseus for a moment is caught between killing the goat herder with a stick or grabbing him by the ears and shoving him into the ground. But, thankfully, Odysseus has learned to control his temper, at least to some extent, and he holds firm and doesn't do anything or reveal himself in any way. Eumaeus the swineherd lifts his hands to the sky and begins to pray that the gods and spirits help bring Odysseus home, because he would never allow someone to act like this. Melanthius the cruel goatherd simply sneers and insults him further, and says that one day he will kidnap the swineherd and sell him far away from Ithaca for a heap of treasure. He carries on, saying he hopes that Apollo shoots Telemachus with silver arrows, or that the suitors kill him, as he is certain Odysseus is never going to come back. In a way, this interaction exhibits why Odysseus wishes to test his household. He wants to find out which of his slaves are like the swineherd, loyal to their master and his family, and which are like the goatherd, cruel and murderous, and using his absence to plot murder and theft, and who would possibly aid the suitors in a fight. The goatherd leaves them behind and rushes ahead to the castle, where he joins the suitors for dinner at his master's expense. The swineherd and the disguised Odysseus are slower to arrive, and when they finally do, the swineherd asks him what his plan is. Does he want to go in alone, or does he want Eumaeus to go with him? He must be careful, Eumaeus tells him. The suitors are violent and are liable to harm him on sight. I'd like to take a moment here to note that this is the third homecoming for Odysseus that has been, well, a tad anticlimactic. When he wakes on the beach, finally having returned to his beloved Ithaca after 20-odd years, he doesn't recognize it. and he doesn't immediately believe Athena when she tells him that he's finally home. Eventually, he learns the truth and is excited and grateful, but the long awaited homecoming has been undercut by suspicion and fear. Then, when he sees his son for this first time since he was an infant in his mother's arms, he cannot immediately greet him or show joy or any emotion at all, instead, just watching as the swineherd greets him the way a father would. The first words he speaks to his son in an interaction we can imagine he has thought about over and over are simply to offer him a seat. And now, once again, another yearned for moment, his return at last to his home, is buried in plans and worries. So, for the first time in 20 years, Odysseus is under the same roof as his beloved wife and son. But there's no joyous homecoming, no feasting and tearful reunions, only uncertainty, deception, and danger. But Odysseus, the great warrior, is calm in the face of these worries and tells the swineherd that he is ready to resist the violence of the suitors. I have been hit before, he says. I know hard knocks. I am resilient. I suffered war and being lost at sea. All true, and yet he currently faces horrifying odds. 118 trained and healthy young men who have spent the past 4 years eating, infiltrating his palace, and possibly corrupting his servants. Meanwhile, he's been stranded, suffered, and starved while witnessing the deaths of all his men. And now he must face these 118 warriors with only Telemachus, untrained and untested in battle, by his side. As though to underscore the many changes made while Odysseus has been gone, an old friend appears. Argos, Odysseus' dog, whom he had trained as a puppy, 20 years old now, but still alive. The dog was beautiful and strong, but since Odysseus' absence, he has been abandoned and neglected, sleeping in a pile of dung, dirty and covered with fleas. The loyal dog is overjoyed to see his master, but is too weak to run and greet him, instead slowly wagging his tail and dropping his ears. Odysseus sees him and wipes away some secret tears at his condition, and asks Eumaeus what has happened to such a handsome dog. Eumaeus replies, "This dog belonged to someone who has died in foreign lands. If he were in good health, as when Odysseus abandoned him and went to Troy, you would see how quick and brave he used to be. But without Odysseus, now he is in bad condition. With his master gone, long dead, the women fail to care for him. Slaves do not want to do their proper work when masters are not watching them." Before Odysseus can approach the dog, he dies, having seen his master for a final time. Inside the palace, Telemachus sees the swineherd enter and waves him over to join him. Then, finally, the disguised Odysseus enters, hobbling in, clinging to his walking stick, before slumping in the doorway. Telemachus tells a serving boy to give Odysseus some bread and to go and beg the suitors for food. Odysseus eats the bread and watches the suitors. When he is finished, Athena appears next to him and tells him to go amongst the suitors and beg for scraps, to find out which are good and which are bad. Although, the poem says, she had no thought of saving any out of the massacre which was to come. This is such an interesting moment. Why test the suitors at all if you intend to kill them, no matter the outcome? Is it perhaps more to familiarize Odysseus with his enemies, or to even simply to raise his ire before battle for his life at home? Regardless, Odysseus walks around the room and begs for scraps of his own food from the suitors. They all pity him and give him food, wondering where he came from. But then, cruel Antinous interrupts, cursing the swineherd for bringing a beggar into their feast and spoiling it, and in a moment of stunning hypocrisy, berates him for bringing someone in to eat away at his master's wealth. Since Antinous' planned to murder Telemachus and share the wealth amongst the suitors, it appears that he already considers the suitors the true masters of Odysseus' home and holdings, and it is thus his own potential wealth that is being eaten. The swineherd speaks up, telling Antinous that while he may be a lord, what he says is trash, and he tells him, "Out of all the suitors, you are the meanest to the slaves, especially me. But if the prudent queen and godlike prince still live here in this house, I do not mind." A lot of bravery from a slave who is clearly laying out where his loyalties lie, despite the risk. Telemachus speaks up, telling Eumaeus to be quiet, that Antinous doesn't deserve an answer, that he is simply trying to pick a fight like he always does. Then Telemachus turns to Antinous, telling him to give the beggar some food, that he can spare it from his coffers, clearly reasserting his place as master of the house. Antinous is enraged and brandishes his footstool in front of him while insulting Telemachus. Odysseus' test is over, but instead of leaving with no harm done, Odysseus instead goes to Antinous and asks again for food. Odysseus flatters Antinous, saying he looks like royalty, and tells him that though he is now a beggar, he used to be extremely wealthy, and when beggars came to his palace, he would help them. He tells Antinous that he had numberless slaves and great wealth, but Zeus destroyed it all. He tells him the same story he told the swineherd about his origins, perhaps to try and warn Antinous that wealth and power can be taken away in an instant. If it is a warning, Antinous doesn't catch it, complaining that the beggar is spoiling his feast, and then he insults the disguised Odysseus further. Odysseus pulls back and says, "You handsome idiot, you would not give a grain of salt from your own house. You sit enjoying someone else's food, and yet you will not give a crumb from this great banquet to me." This accurate assessment of his character is more than Antinous can bear, and he hurls his footstool at the elderly beggar. But Odysseus doesn't move, and silently contemplates his revenge before addressing the crowd of suitors. He tells them there is no shame in fighting to protect your own possessions or wealth, but Antinous has wounded him for simply being hungry. He ends by saying, "If there are gods of the poor, or furies to avenge us, may he be struck by death instead of marriage." Why did Odysseus do this? Why provoke him to violence? Is this similar to his taunting of the Cyclops Polyphemus, a need to insult and have the last word? Or is he exposing the hypocrisy of the suitors, asking them if they are willing to fight and possibly die for another man's wealth? Or is he giving them a roundabout warning, an opportunity to see their behavior reflected in Antinous' treatment of a beggar and leave before the avenging furies arrive? Whatever the reason, Antinous is unmoved, telling him to leave immediately or the suitors will all drag him across the palace and have him flayed alive. The other suitors are not quite so quick to risk the ire of the gods and reproach Antinous for his actions, telling them the man may be a god in disguise, as the gods often take the shape of foreigners and strangers to test mortals to see who violates their holy laws and who is good. This is an interesting moment because the suitors, in a way, a god is testing the suitors. Athena has disguised Odysseus and she's told him to test the men. But the men have already failed the test by overstaying their welcome and violating the guest-host relationship. They're already doomed, and though they scold Antinous now, they've been happily eating Odysseus' wealth and plotting to murder his son and take his wife and throne, and they're still doing it. Telemachus watches, pained to see his father treated so badly, but following his instructions and remaining stoic. He says nothing, just shaking his head and, like his father, planning revenge. Penelope has been listening to the exchange from the hall and tells her slaves that she hopes Apollo shoots Antinous for his behavior. Telemachus' old nanny agrees, and Penelope says, "They are all our enemies and mean to do us harm. But Antinous, she says, is the worst of them all. He is like death." So we have it. All three members of the family are plotting the deaths of these invaders. Penelope calls for the swineherd and asks him to send the beggar to speak to her. He has wandered far, and she wants to ask him if he has heard of her long-lost husband. Eumaeus tells her that the beggar has a fantastic story, and that he has said that Odysseus is still alive and is on his way home with a pile of treasure. Penelope tells him to send the beggar over, that she wishes to hear him tell her himself, and then speaks with disgust once more about the suitors and how they are decimating the family's wealth. She is desperate for any word of Odysseus, because if he came back, he and Telemachus would surely take revenge on the suitors for their actions. At this moment, Telemachus sneezes, and Penelope declares that it is an omen, a sign of death for all the suitors, a message from the gods that no one can save them from their ruin now. She asks again for the stranger to visit her, saying that if what he says is true, she will give him fine clothes. Eumaeus goes to the disguised Odysseus and relays Penelope's request to him. Odysseus says, "I will tell the truth, the whole truth, to Penelope, and soon. I know about Odysseus. We shared in suffering." But, he says, the suitors and their aggression has frightened him. He tells Eumaeus to tell Penelope to stay where she is until nightfall, no matter how eager for news she is. Then, at dusk, she may come near and sit beside the fire with him, and he will answer her questions. Has Odysseus fallen momentarily out of character by giving Eumaeus and, indirectly, Penelope orders? If he suspects anything, the swineherd doesn't mention it, returning to Penelope and relaying the order to her, saying he agrees with the beggar, that it's safer for all of them to stay out of the suitors' way while they are so aggressive and excited. Penelope replies, "The stranger is no fool, at least. There never were such bullies as these men, and they intend us harm." Penelope sees the danger of the situation, and despite her desperation for news, is willing to wait for answers. The swineherd returns to Telemachus and tells him he must return to look after the pigs and to protect Telemachus's property and his own. He tells him, "You should take care of everything, but most of all, yourself. Do not get hurt. So many mean you harm. I pray that Zeus obliterates them all before they injure us." Telemachus agrees and sends him on his way with the assurance that the rest is up to me and up to the gods. The stage is set, the plan is in motion, and though Telemachus, Odysseus, and Penelope are finally once again under the same roof, they are in more danger than ever. And that's where the chapter ends. Join me next time, guys, for chapter 18.